Hello, everyone. I'm Donna Hawley, president of the Investment Institute. And on behalf of Andrea Zigathi and myself, we are so happy to have you here for the 7th session from our coffee break series. To our TII community, we love seeing your names on our screens for all of these sessions. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for spreading the word, because we have so many new names here listening to us today. And welcome to all of you newcomers. We are so happy to have you. Andrea and I welcome you. And if you'd ever like to have a call, we'd love to meet you and hear all about you. We feel like this is so one-sided at this point, and we're used to being in person with our community, but welcome and just glad you're here. Today, Andrea and I are so excited to have Albert Cha and Larry Kochard discussing life science investing. Albert is partner at Vivo Capital, and we've had the privilege of having him speak in the past and have been looking for a good excuse to have him back, and this seems like the perfect time. Larry is CIO at Makena Capital Management and a dear friend of Andrea's and of mine, and every day is a good day to hear from Larry, so we're so happy he's here to help moderate this discussion. Just a few quick logistics before we get going. Please take a moment, if you're not familiar yet with Zoom, please take a moment to find the Q&A feature on the screen. What we ask that you do is, even right away, if you have any questions at all about anything going on in the session, please do type them in right away. Larry will be monitoring the questions throughout the session, and we'd love to have him incorporate as many as possible. So the sooner you get them in, the sooner he can take a look at them and get things incorporated. After the webinar today, you will receive an email from us. It will contain links for how you can listen to the recording for this, as well as our past Coffee Break series sessions. So please take a look at those. And also there'll be a link for a survey. We cannot tell you how much it means to us, but it's a lot to get your input. So if you could take a few minutes just to answer the questions, it's super quick. For those who'd like CPE credits for this session, we'll be offering one. You need to be on for the full session. You should have received an email prior to this webinar with instructions and with the form. Please let us know if you have any questions afterwards, and we'll be happy to help. With that, it is my great honor to hand this off to Larry, and thank you both so much, you, Larry, and Albert. Thank you.
Donna, thank you for that very nice introduction. I also want to thank both you and Andrea and the rest of the Investment Institute team for continuing to offer content, investment content, during this challenging pandemic time. I know it's a lot of work. It tries everyone's technology skills, but I think it's been very effective, and we all appreciate it. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today for this conversation with Albert Cha, who's the managing partner at Vivo Ventures. I met Albert about 14 years ago. Been very impressed with everything he's done over the years. And I'm going to have a series of questions that I will ask Albert about his investment experience, what he likes. We will later in the conversation, because I don't want to lead with this, have a question about COVID-19 and the pandemic and his thoughts on that. But I really wanted to make sure we hit really some other investment questions that are more closely related to what they're investing in. So why don't we just start with, Albert, I've known you for about 14 years. You've been investing at Vivo for about 20 years, which is a very long period of time. What has changed over that period of time? So that's kind of question A, part A. And question part B is, what lessons have you learned over that time period?
First of all, thank you very much, Larry, for having me and for the Investment Institute to have a chance to speak and share my perspectives in life science investing. 20 years is a long time. It's quite amazing to realize that it was 20 years ago that the Human Genome Project completed, and the world was excited about the prospect of knowing what every gene looked like. Unfortunately, at that time, it wasn't clear the path to turning the gene sequences into new therapies, and that was actually when the bubble burst in 2001, and there wasn't immediate translation. If I were to make an analogy, back then, finding new drugs was like being in a dark house at night with a flashlight, trying to look for needles in a haystack. The statistics were that the FDA shared a drug that entered clinical trials, the chance was less than 1 in 10 that that drug would make it out the other side into an FDA-approved product. That makes investing in a sector, pretty challenging. Now to come to 2020, the analogy I would make is that now the sun has come out and we have the ability with a remarkable number of tools derived from that Human Genome Project sequencing, enabling us to understand the basis of disease, the genes that cause them, and an amazing spectrum of tools that enable us to treat those diseases, whether it's gene therapy, antibodies, RNA interference, or highly targeted small molecules. The other huge change that has occurred is that there's been massive growth in the size of the public markets in biotech. Biotech has been the leading source of new public companies over the last 5 or 6 years, with over 250 new IPOs just in the last 5 years alone. And that's been driven in part by successes, major successes we've seen. For instance, a drug called Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy that can be given as an intravenous injection once to a child with a very rare but uniformly fatal disease called spinal muscular atrophy. These patients die by the age of 2. With this treatment, these kids can approach functional lives that never would have been possible before. And as a physician, that kind of remarkable transformation is exciting and transformative. And as these companies have developed these therapies as public companies, there have been big returns that can be generated in the public market, as the risk-reward curve have been moving from private markets into the public markets. I think in terms of lessons learned, Larry, I think one of the key things is that while fidelity of predicting science from a test tube to an animal to human is not 100%, it's far better than what we saw 20 years ago. And that higher translatability has led to increased amounts of investments, increased returns, and obviously a space that's extremely exciting right now. I think we're in the golden age of biotech. But the other lesson learned is that access to capital for these companies is critically important. None of these companies have $1 in revenue to speak of. They have to spend potentially hundreds of millions of dollars doing clinical trials to get their products approved. And having seen and lived through several financial crises and seeing some of my colleagues and friends at life science funds that have slowly exited the business, it's not that easy to make sure to have the capital for these companies. And so that's the lifeblood of our business.
I'm curious, and looking at your background, just a really impressive background. Stanford engineer, electrical engineering, both bachelor's and master's degree, then a Ph.D. in neuroscience, MD. It does seem to be a sector where it pays to have that level of academic experience. And I do know versus generalist investors. I'd be curious of what your thoughts are. Is that really just table stakes to be an investor? A related question is, I'm just thinking through what makes for a great investor in general, is oftentimes people can be great analysts. They understand the science, they can understand the business, but it doesn't always translate into being a great investor. And so there could be someone that's a great scientist, understands the science, but doesn't necessarily understand the business. I'd be curious of your thoughts on what makes for a successful investor across all the subsectors of healthcare.
Yeah, so I think the good news, Larry, is that there is actually a lot of different paths, and I have a lot of friends and colleagues in the business who have done extremely well in life science investing. So there's many different ways to create value. I think there's no question from my personal perspective that having the benefit of a medical degree, being a physician, and having done a PhD delving into the science made it easier for me. Ultimately, the table stakes, regardless of the path that one takes to becoming a successful investor, are really about two things. The first is understanding the science that really drives how a product or a platform is going to work. But the second part is then translating that product or platform into something that's going to have a big impact on a patient's life, and ultimately a physician will prescribe it. These really drive the value creation curves. And so as I think about what's required to be a successful investor, those skills are table stakes. On top of that, though, it's also important to be able to build relationships with people who can make these things successful. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper with a structure on it. You need to have people who can build teams. You have to have people who understand how to manage the FDA, to do the right clinical trials, be able to attract top key opinion leaders. Ultimately, you have to convince potential pharmaceutical companies that might buy your company that your product is really meaningful. And so I think ultimately the last point is that then to be a great investor, one has to understand the valuation, which is to say, what is this product ultimately worth? Make a probability adjusted estimate of what that's likely to be, and then look at the valuation at which the investment is being made and say, is there a good return there? And so that's where the inefficiencies and opportunities can be, but obviously then that's what turns what's a science into an art. And then having the skill set to understand that, and then ultimately build relationships with these companies, because they get to choose. The great companies get to choose who their capital partners are. And so it's not just about being smart. You have to be able to compel teams to say, we want your capital, and your capital is going to help us be successful. And the value that you add to our company is what's going to drive who we choose in our syndicate. Because again, great companies they have those choices.
Follow-up question, I guess right now, again, 20 years in, what are the most attractive subsectors within all of healthcare? So maybe not even just one, but are there a couple that you really are focused on more than others?
Sure. So fortunately, biotech and pharma make up 58% of the global market cap of all healthcare companies. So it happens to be the dominant sector within healthcare. I think also because these large pharma and biotech companies are constantly trying to make sure they're filling their pipelines, because as the products come off patents, they have to restore those with next generation products. So there's constant activity in biotech with regards to partnership and merger and acquisition activity. In terms of even within biotech, there are certain areas that are particularly interesting that have generated a lot of value. New treatments for cancer, not surprisingly, have been a focal point for many firms, including ourselves, because patients obviously don't have a lot of alternatives, and extending life is a focal point of healthcare. To give one example, a company called 47, which went public a few years ago, had a therapy that demonstrated some really outstanding clinical activity just late last year for treating patients with two very difficult to treat blood cancers, what's called myelodysplastic syndrome and its partner, acute myeloid leukemia. That data came out, the stock ripped, the company raised a bunch of money at a $2 billion market cap, but ultimately then entered into significant M&A dialogue, and Gilead came along and paid $5 billion for a company that hasn't even completed phase 3 trials yet. So we're still talking several years from FDA approval, but the data was so compelling because this will revolutionize these patients' outcomes with these cancers. That is obviously, it's a great outcome for everybody involved, including obviously the patients. Two other areas that I would say have done particularly well, what I would call orphan diseases. These are rare diseases that affect less than 200,000 Americans is the threshold. The needs for these patients are typically great because there may be no FDA-approved product for these patients. And then the last category I would say are diseases that are genetically defined, maybe caused by a single mutation, but can result in terrible outcomes. And again, these are very interesting areas to invest. I'd say one area that has been more challenging over the last few years has been the generic pharmaceutical space, largely driven by managed care consolidating and then driving prices down for products that candidly lack innovation. And so it's hard to protect those prices when all the products are basically the same and they're commodities. Not to suggest that that's not an interesting space, it's just been a harder space relative to some of these other areas.
Okay. On a personal note, just kind of in a really narrow sector, I know, again, getting back to your Ph.D. was in neuroscience, and I know you were fascinated with the brain just in general. Is from a personal standpoint, my father passed away with Alzheimer's about a decade ago, and it seems to be an area of research that has been challenged over the years in terms of making much progress. Are you seeing anything interesting there? Are there any businesses that you've looked at, or I'd just be curious of your thoughts on that.
Yes, it's a space that for me has been a huge personal passion, dating back to when I read the book Awakenings by Dr. Oliver Sacks, talking about revolutionizing Parkinson's disease treatments. The reason why neuroscience has been so hard, and your intuition is spot on as always, is that the brain is the one organ that is dramatically different in humans versus other species. And so the animal models that we often use to figure out whether we think a drug is either going to work or be safe is particularly challenging in the brain. I think the other part is that some of these diseases turn out to actually be much more complicated because they may be multiple diseases in one. And so Alzheimer's disease, which is a tragically terrible disease, affects millions of Americans every year. It appears that it may be caused by multiple different reasons. It's a compendium of clinical symptoms that may actually be caused by a bunch of different underlying factors that we're still now just starting to map out. And so I think that the challenge will be trying to understand for which Alzheimer's patients, which therapies will make the most sense. And we're making good progress, but candidly, this field is probably going to be the last bastion as I think about the future of biotech of where treatments will come. We're making great progress on cancer. There's a lot of diseases, autoimmune diseases we've got good therapies for as we understand, again, what's the underlying mechanisms. But the brain is going to be the toughest part because of its complexity and challenges studying it in anything other than human beings. But that said, I'm very optimistic that over the next 10 years, we're going to see the decade of the brain in terms of research. So I'm excited about that.
No, thanks. No, thank you for that. I'd be curious of, we talk a lot about in investing, we hear a lot about what's going on in the US, but I'm curious in terms of your experience and your views on the opportunity set investing outside the US across the healthcare sector and specifically maybe biotech or other sectors. I'd love your views.
Yes, so as a firm, we've always been global in orientation, although the reality is the vast majority of innovation has historically come here in the US. But scientific innovation is global. The discoveries can be made in Europe, as many of them are, and increasingly we're seeing them in Asia. There's a strong history of drug development in Japan, Korea, and now we're seeing significant growth in China. We're seeing entrepreneurs and management teams, talented people who have been trained by the large pharmas in the US and Europe, going back to Asia to start companies and develop novel therapies that can be meaningfully better than what's been developed in other parts of the world. A recent example, actually, one of the largest IPOs of 2020 is actually a Chinese company called Legend Biotech. They're developing a novel cell therapy for the treatment of multiple myeloma, a disease where patients run through many therapies and ultimately fail them all. They took a similar approach to a highly visible first mover company here in the US called Bluebird. Legend's response rates for multiple myeloma appear to have significantly improved upon what Bluebird did. And that led to one of the most successful IPOs this year. The other part that we're seeing is that accessibility to capital is shifting. Hong Kong has actually started a biotech exchange for IPOs for companies in Asia that don't have any revenues. That market just opened in 2018. It's now the second leading fundraising center for biotech globally. And we're seeing more and more innovative companies heading for IPOs there.
Thank you. I know when you've been talking about some companies, you've talked both public as well as private. It seems to be a sector where there are a number of managers that invest both across both public and private. I'd be curious of is that something you think is important to have the capability to do both public and private, and B, as an allocator such as ourselves, do you think we should have exposure to both the public as well as the private markets? And is it better for us to have a mandate with someone that has the flexibility of going public or private? I'd be curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so in general, I would say LPs should get exposure to both. The private part is obviously where the biotech companies are created, and there can be significant value opportunity there. In addition, those private funds probably have less volatility in their mark-to-market valuations. What's been interesting to see is that as companies have been going public earlier and earlier in their life cycle, so for example, I think half the IPOs that have gone public this year in biotech haven't had any patient-level data at all. Literally, all the data they have is just in animals. And so as we think about where the value creation is occurring in these companies, it's happening after they go public. And so while the private investment side has had an important role, the pool of capital for public biotech is much bigger And it needs to be much bigger because the cost of, again, of these clinical trials and gaining FDA approvals is massive. And these public companies often look just like the private brethren. So as I think about both value creation as well as the opportunity set, ideally you have investors who understand both. And I think that's important because obviously these companies go through their trials and tribulation privately first. You get to know the management teams. But then in terms of the alpha opportunity, the public side is increasingly important as where the returns are being generated because these companies are getting those clinical trial results after they're already public. And then I think about the value add skill set, which I think is critically important, regardless of which side you play on. Obviously, making sure that you have good teams, complementing those teams, even sometimes making CEO changes, which can happen both privately and publicly. And then the value set on what creates value for public companies, which means analyst coverage, getting other investors to find the company interesting, getting top tier investment banks involved. All those kinds of skills, I would say, are on top of everything that you do as a private investor. And so the broad skill set that makes, I think, for successful investing, you ideally have an understanding of both to do well.
Got it. Well, speaking of the public markets, biotech stocks have been on a tear. Some of it's related to just news related to the pandemic, but A, I'd be curious of your thoughts of the sustainability of that. And then B, just, I don't think you short, but are there, but are there opportunities? Is that something you think we all ought to be looking at, is to the extent that there are companies that it's just overdone, there's just too much investor interest? Is that something that's interesting, or is that something that you would be wary of?
Sure. So there are plenty of hedge funds and business model with shorting is an important part. I think from our perspective at Vivo, the challenge with shorting is that if you get it wrong, and the easiest way to get it wrong is that company gets bought by big pharma.
It can be pretty painful.
It can be very painful. And so I think that rather than focusing on trying to manage the downside from a shorting perspective, it's probably more incumbent to try to identify which companies are more favorably valued. Meaning that if you can find returns actually in any market, even right now, given the fact that the NBI, the Nasdaq Biotech Index, is at an all-time high, there's still plenty of individual companies that are attractively valued relative to others. And then to come back to your main question with regards to, is the bull market sustainable? My question is absolutely yes, in the long term. And the reason that drives that is, again, the continued innovation and research and development that drives new therapies that are going to change patient lives and deliver value to all stakeholders, including physicians and to managed care providers who can save the healthcare system money in many of these situations where otherwise these patients would have terrible outcomes. That engine's just going to keep going. And so I'm very confident that that innovation will continue to obsolete old therapies and make new ones that are valuable for society as a whole and generate value. That said, that's a long-term view. There's no question, given where we are in the markets, that there can be tremendous volatility in the short to medium term. And so it means that obviously valuation discipline and being thoughtful about where a firm makes its investments is obviously very important.
I'm going to, a related question, because a question from one of the audience members is, the question is, given that the accessibility to capital has increased and has lowered the cost of capital for life science sector companies, does this imply that the easy money has been made? Meaning, will long-term investors have lower returns in the future? And I assume your answer is no, given what you just said, but I'd be curious. And I guess part of it is just distinguishing just a passive allocation to investing in the sector, sort of the beta from the sector, versus the opportunity for active management.
Yeah. So I think that on a static basis, one could say there's so much money in the space that there's not money to be made. But remember that all of these companies, I mean, think about, for example, the 30 companies that went public this year that don't have any human data. Some of those will be successful and some of them won't. And as those ones that are successful generate therapies that become more and more obvious to investors and to the strategics, that they're going to generate significant revenues, potentially billions of dollars, those trajectories, those opportunities for returns are very significant. The hard part is which ones, right? So you can take 2 points of view. One is just own the index, and certainly that's one way to go. But I think ultimately the decision-making around figuring out which of those companies are most likely to invest, getting them at the best times of valuation. And by the way, volatility means, yes, we could see 10, 20% downturn with various news concerns about drug prices. This happens in our sector all the time. Hillary Clinton's tweet in 2015 dropped the whole sector by 30%. That becomes a buying opportunity for those folks who have the capital availability to do it and understand the fact that there is volatility and the entry price actually really does matter. But there's still fundamental value creation opportunities across the space. It's very company dependent, and then not just picking, but then ensuring that those companies, especially when things get tough, have continued access to capital is extraordinarily important, which is why, having lived through the 2009 financial crisis, we've been there before. We understand it.
Another question from the audience, which actually is a question I had as well, is how do you see the impact of the upcoming presidential elections and sort of then the related impact on regulatory risk?
Yeah, so I think that regulatory risk, I'll hit that first and then I'll come back to the election. The regulatory risk with FDA has changed dramatically over the last 15 years. For those who remember Vioxx and how that was pulled off the market as a drug that treated pain of arthritis but caused heart attacks, that's a terrible risk-benefit ratio. The new generation of drugs and therapeutics are often very targeted to a specific gene in a way that, again, the risk-benefit has fundamentally changed. And given the FDA's understanding of that and willingness to then approve drugs, often in an accelerated fashion, because again, with a better understanding of the underlying disease, they can pick endpoints that they can get comfortable with, where you don't have to study 10,000 patients to get a drug approved. Sometimes you only need 50 or 100. And so I think the regulatory framework, because the FDA is all about science too, has fundamentally changed the risk profile around getting drugs approved to where we're seeing 50, 60 new drugs approved a year. And I don't think that that's going to change significantly depending on who's in the White House or who's in Congress. So I think everybody's interested in getting new therapies to patients, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. Coming back to the election question, there's always more noise in biotech and healthcare around an election. No two ways about it. I think Trump recently signed an executive order trying to address some of these issues, although it's pretty clear that may not actually play through in a time frame that matters for him. And drug prices will again be a topic, as it always is, and we expect that. That said, I think because of the timing of this year's election, which is happening in the middle of COVID, and how we're going to survive the pandemic, it strikes me that it probably won't be as hot a topic as it has been in previous presidential election cycles, because everybody's focused on trying to make sure we've got enough vaccines and therapies to survive what is right now a tragic, tragic global phenomenon, both in lives and obviously in economies. So while it will definitely come up as a topic, I think that the noise will be softened by acknowledgement that both parties are going to be trying to figure out how quickly we can get control of COVID.
A more tangential sort of regulatory risk is, you mentioned investing, you mentioned Hong Kong, you mentioned, investing in China, is, there seems to be a growing risk of, even though this is not a panel on or interview on China, but just given what's going on, which seems to be slipping into a potential Cold War, is that something that you have any thoughts on, and how that influences the way you would be investing over there?
It's a great question, Larry. I think that the overall silver lining on therapeutics relative to, let's say, aerospace or cybersecurity or some of the other sectors is that whether you're a Chinese patient or an American patient, the therapy is very likely to work in both. And there's, I think, broad governmental support for not trying to prevent therapies from being provided to their relative constituents. So for example, the Chinese FDA has dramatically changed their regulations to make it possible for drugs to be approved much more quickly in China, even if it's never been studied in a single Chinese patient, based on results in other parts of the world, in part to address this societal need for them to be perceived as trying to enable their population to have access to these medicines. And in the same way, obviously there's been legislation with regards to Chinese companies going public in the US with scandals around Luckin Coffee. And yet, if you look at some of the biggest, most successful IPOs of late, a number of them, including the company Legend I mentioned earlier, Chinese company listing in the US. No issues there. Again, it's got Johnson & Johnson as a partner. But I think the main point is that healthcare is a global space. We're treating people around the world. The science, again, is global. And so I think relative to other sectors, we're not seeing the impact as much. With one caveat, I do think that given the ongoing conflict, there will be certain things that will be focused on. With each individual country feels the need to have access to it. And obviously you're seeing this play through with COVID-19 vaccines, with research and development being driven by different parts of the world and trying to ensure that those governments and people have access to those vaccines. That's going to play through in a very interesting way. And I think in that regard, the US is very well situated with a lot of the top technologies that have been developed for many years in vaccines being provided, but with strong players in Europe and China as well that can provide local vaccine manufacturers for obviously what's going to be very important to solve.
Well, that's a good segue, speaking of vaccines, of talking about COVID-19, and just your thoughts on the research and the testing that's going on in terms of therapeutics, as well as the different vaccines. There are a lot of candidates, some of them using new technologies like Moderna. I'd be curious of your thoughts across the range of both therapeutics as well as the vaccines that are being examined.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the good news is that there's a lot of understandings of vaccines in general and what's required in terms of protective levels of antibodies to get patients and people to either prevent infection or to significantly reduce the severity of infections, both of which are extremely important. And so while we don't have phase 3 data to hold in our hands, I'm quite confident that over the next 6 to 9 months, we're going to see results from these large clinical trials with vaccines, starting with Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech, but Novavax and others, that are going to demonstrate significant benefit from these vaccines. And that will be the first step in reducing the spread of the pandemic and bringing things closer to normal. In addition to the vaccines, there are therapies being developed. Remdesivir was the first, but there's actually quite a few other therapies, including antibodies and others, that we believe will be beneficial, both in terms of prevention as well as in treatment of patients who have already contracted the disease. I think, though, with all of that said, and our general optimism as a firm and myself, that vaccines are going to come and be successful, the biggest next challenge we have is actually getting them distributed and getting people to actually take the vaccines, which I think is actually not necessarily as obvious a hurdle as those of us on this call might believe. A lot of concerns about safety. I think I can reassure this audience that because these vaccines are so targeted in their development, we're not dealing with something that's going to stimulate an immune response to a whole bunch of things. They're really tailored to the virus. That the risk benefit for these vaccines across the board are going to be good, but some will be better than others. Some may have to be taken every year. Others could be longer lasting, but may not work as well the second time. The good news is there's so many being developed that I'm confident as a collective, we're going to have a lot of options to provide people to help protect them against getting infected.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just saw a poll recently in terms of the percentage of people that said they'd be very likely or unlikely to take a vaccine, and it was I think very likely is something like 35%. It was not a high number, so I think that will be a very interesting challenge. Just related to Moderna and their new approach, does that technology of using messenger RNA, do you think this then is hopeful to be applied then into other diseases? I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, and Moderna has a platform that can address other diseases, including cancer. That said, the Moderna platform is one where they have never delivered an FDA-approved product. And so it has its own set of risks that will be proven out over time. Again, the situation with COVID is the risk-benefit is such that as long as it's safe, even if it works not perfectly, people are going to use it like water, hopefully, right? But the point is that these same technologies that stimulate the immune system can absolutely be used for different diseases in different contexts. I think the biggest question is going to be with regards to Moderna and the mRNA vaccines in general. How long does the immune response last? And then secondly, outcomes with COVID. Those are the questions that still have yet to play through, and why I think I'm grateful that there's many other approaches being simultaneously developed so that we have multiple options that can help the broad population.
How about in terms of COVID and its impact on the rest of the healthcare? I know there are a lot of hospitals that have been challenged just given the, the cessation in elective procedures. And then there's a lot of studies that are non-COVID related studies on certain drugs that are being held up. But I'd just be curious if, has A, that affected your investments, or B, just what your thoughts are?
Yes, no, great question, Larry. So I would say that you hit the key spots, which are that the biggest impact, at least within biotech, our sector, is that the healthcare systems have been under significant P&L pressure because a lot of the revenues that they had going to other sources of treatments have been diverted to take care of COVID patients. And as COVID gets under better control, that has released that pressure. And as COVID has now elevated, they're facing intensive care unit facilities that are filled with COVID patients, which unfortunately is not a good generator for reimbursements from the healthcare system. So those pressures are going to wax and wane as we get better and worse control of COVID. But my belief, again, as we get better control, not maybe perhaps mass vaccinations, but broader protection as a population, that will come under control. With regards to the other impact, it is enrollment in clinical studies. And that impact has varied depending on how serious the disease is. If you're doing clinical trials in cancer or in some of these rare diseases where there's no opportunities for therapy, those have been less impacted because those patients are still seeking care even in the midst of COVID. But for other diseases that are not as life-threatening, timelines are pushed out and companies have come under pressure. But that all said, I would say, at least for biotech, as we've discussed earlier, COVID has been a broader tailwind for, I think, the acknowledgement and recognition by investors as a group that this is the sector that's going to help us get out of this mess, that's going to help us diagnose, treat, and ultimately protect people against contracting the disease. Okay.
Just circling back to, again, your background in education, electrical engineering. I'd just be curious, and we had a question from the audience of sort of the intersection of big data, AI, and then biotech, and just sort of that intersection. And I know I've heard a number of managers talk about this and invest, backing that theme. I'd be curious of your thoughts on that. If you have any examples of companies that you think will be big beneficiaries.
So I think that the best part of I would say AI and drug development would probably fall into two categories. I think the first is leveraging big data about genetic information that ties to patients' diseases, how they've done, what they've suffered from, to try to identify genetic tendencies and help us understand what targets we can treat that might treat a given disease. And so basically observation in big data and genetics leading to biological innovations that can help us develop a new generation of therapies is probably the lowest hanging fruit. And we've already seen some of that play through. Companies like Arrowhead that have identified specific genetic mutations that can deliver better cardiovascular outcomes, as an example. So I think the second place where we see it playing through is using big data and AI to improve the prediction of drugs to be safe in patients, relying obviously right now as we do on animal models to provide a lot of that color. Again, not perfect, but to the extent to which we know various structures of drugs and the toxicities that are seen that right now we're using biology to determine. I think more and more data and computational analysis, the better that we can predict that, the less time we waste on drugs that candidly aren't safe. I think the challenge is that with broader big data analysis, ensuring that there's a really strong scientific biological lens as opposed to throwing a lot of information into a computer and saying, I'm going to use deep learning or neural networks. My master's thesis at Stanford was actually in neural networks. And so it's kind of a garbage in, garbage out. If you put in a lot of information, but it's not well understood, you're not going to get a lot of good things out of it. I mean, that was one thing I learned in my thesis project. And so I think that it's really important to make sure that companies in this space, which is very exciting, have really strong science involved in guiding how the data is analyzed.
Another question from the audience is, can you address your portfolio construction axioms? Are there certain principles that you follow, framework that you follow in terms of building out your portfolio?
Sure. So I think what we've done is taken both a top-down and bottoms-up view, which is to say that within biotech, I mentioned that there were 3 favorite subsectors that we think a lot of value is being created in: cancer, orphan diseases, genetically identifiable diseases. And so at least for our public fund, that constitutes about 80% of our fair market value. So we use that general axiom. And then with regards to how we build a portfolio, obviously there are different degrees and levels of conviction, even within a portfolio, and we're looking for high probability successes. We're not looking for, within our portfolio, a lot of zeros and a couple 10-baggers. That is a different investment philosophy, but I think our view is we should use the science and the medicine and the FDA understandings to look for high probability success. But even within that, there'll be a range. So there'll probably be, let's call it 10 positions that may be half the portfolio, where we have high degrees of conviction and we've done a ton of work. And then there'll be a broader degree of companies where we may have smaller exposures, where we're waiting for additional information to come through that gives us more confidence, and then we can put more into a given company. So probably not so different from how others might think.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to close on one last question, which is always the hardest ones, is just thinking back through your 20 years and your biggest mistakes. Are the mistakes more related to the science, getting the science wrong, or is it related to really the people? Maybe just sort of the business quality, the people. I'd be curious of kind of lessons learned on that front.
Yes, so having done this for 20 years, I can say I've made mistakes on science, people, and clinical trials. Those are the 3 failure points for biotech. But I would say probably the biggest challenges have actually been mostly around the clinical trials themselves. So in other words, the science may predict that something may work, and I'll give an example. You may have a drug to treat kids with short stature. They're just not tall enough. And so you give them a product like growth hormone that helps them grow. And you have to test it versus a placebo. And I can tell you that placebo doesn't help these kids grow very much, and growth hormone helps a lot. And height is a very quantitative measure, meaning that you can't fake it. You use a ruler. You're not going to get wrong readings. Take a disease, though, like pain. Pain is actually something that there's no way to measure it with a ruler. People have to self-report it. And the other problem is that if people take a purple pill and they think that it's drug, their pain gets better regardless of whether there was any drug in it or not. And so there's fundamental risk around trials in certain areas of therapeutics that fundamentally have much higher risk. And I would say over time, having done this for 20 years, we've come to certain axioms about how we think about risk depending on what the nature of the clinical trial is. That's probably one of the key learnings for me.
Okay. I'm going to close on a softball question. Is, I know, at least I understand, that you and your wife met in medical school, and I believe you have 3 children. Curious of whether you and your wife will advise your kids to go to medical school, or advise them against going to medical school in the future.
It's funny that you asked this, because I've actually pushed all our kids to think about alternative careers outside of medicine. I was originally an electrical engineer. I love computer programming. I live in Silicon Valley. And so I've encouraged them to look at other fields. And yet my oldest, my daughter, has wanted to be a physician since she was 5. And my 2 sons are expressing an interest in medical school. So I actually don't know. They've tried hard to guide them down different paths. I really have. And yet all 3 of them are interested in medical school. So all I've said is, look, kids. There's a lot of opportunities that you can do that span far beyond practicing medicine if you have a medical degree. And I think they've just seen what I've done, and for whatever reason, I can't get them to at least not focus on doing this. So for what it's worth, I tried.
Well, as a parent of 4 children, they usually end up doing, they go against what you're advising. So I think that's fairly consistent. So on that note, I don't know if there's any other things that you wanted to bring up that I didn't ask you, but if not, I think we can close. And I'm going to give the back over to Andrea, who's going to talk about some future programs, I believe.
Yeah, thank you both. And Albert, can you convince my girls to go to medical school? Because I would love them to both go to medical school. But they just want to be in marketing and do kind of things like I do. But that would be pretty cool. I'm going to connect the two of you. But listen,
Larry
thank
just
you.
told, the lesson was just tell them what not to do and they'll do it. She should have told me that 14 years ago.
Thank you so much, Albert, and thank you, Larry. On behalf of Donna and I, thank you to everybody watching today, and especially to have friends like Larry and Albert to help us educate the members. We're so grateful, so thank you. Just a few upcoming sessions that we have for all of you who are on today. Thursday, August 20th, we will announce the topic and the speaker. We're working on it right now, but it's August 20th, so if you can hold your calendar for 2 to 2:50. It's usually every other week, but we're going to do one in August. So there'll just be one of these in August. A lot of people are on vacation. We thought it would be best to just leave it to August 20th. Then we have the asset owner meetings, which I don't know if all of you know about, but there's some new allocators on this call today, and we're doing a really cool meetup series. And they're 8 to 10, no more than 10. CIOs, PMs, senior people from your offices can join, and you have to be on the staff of an endowment, foundation, hospital pension, or a single family office. So August 4th, we have about 4 seats left, so please email me right away if you'd like to participate in August 4th. August 18th, we are allowing some fund-to-funds consultants and OCIOs to take part in that one. So if you would like to be part of the August 18th one, and you're not a pure asset owner, but you're still an allocator, you're welcome to join on the August 18th. And on Tuesday, September 1st is another date that we'll do. These are from 2 to 3:30. They don't always last till 3:30, but it's just really informal, and we get on and everybody talks about their portfolio, and it's just been really well attended, and we've learned a lot from everyone. And then most importantly, we are moving forward with the October 26th, 27th meeting at the Angus Barn Pavilion in Raleigh. If you haven't already registered, or let us know if you are coming or not coming, it is open air, it's outdoors, all the walls retract. I've said this every week, but for those new ones that are on the call today, I hope you can join us. We're gonna do it in a safe way, socially distant, and it will be probably not 300 people, probably 150 people. But we're going to keep it to a smaller group, and we hope you can make it. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for participating today, Albert and Larry, and we look forward to the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.